President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call in progress be initiated.
Without objection.
And I ask that I be recognized for such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Yeah, Mr. President, we're having a lot of discussion, and people are lined up now talking about this event that's going to take place in the middle of December. And it's going to be the 21st CAP. That's a meeting that the United Nations puts on every year. It's been on for 21 years now. And they're all talking about this is the time. This is what they said every time, for 21 years, that we're going to adopt something in this country. Prior, they've been using legislation that is going to reduce the emissions of CO2 and the devastation that would be on our economy. And there's nothing different now, except everything, as time goes by, time has not been their friends. We have the alarmists who really believe that the world's coming to an end because of global warming. And, you know, some of them actually believe that. Now, a lot of them, it's just kind of the in thing to do. And you have Tom Steyer out there with $75 million trying to resurrect this as an issue. But there are some who really do believe it. And the problem is time is not doing them a favor, because every time a week or a month goes by, somebody else comes out with some new information. A recent study that was published in it was a NASA study actually, published in the Journal of Glaciology, found that gains in the Antarctic ice sheets are much greater than the estimated losses. This runs counter to the IPCC 2013 report that suggests there was a net loss of ice on the continent. Now let's look for a minute at what the IPCC is. The IPCC is an arm of the United Nations. They have put together these studies of people, and this has been going on now for more than 15 years. And the only qualifications you have, I guess, to be one of the scientists is you have to believe in this. We have testimony from a lot of different members of the scientific community who have said that because of their position in opposition to the anthropogenic gases causing global warming, causing the destruction of the earth, has caused them not to be a part of this. And there's no better evidence of that than in 2009 when they came out and made it very clear in 2009 that the science that they're dependent on was the IPCC, that's the International on Climate Change, that it was totally discredited with what they call ClimateGate. And we've talked about this on the floor several times, and I thought that would have ended it back in 2009, but it didn't do it. I only mentioned that background because we're going to have the Paris trip coming up, and there'll be a lot of people going there to try to fortify their positions. Now, since the 1970s, the IPCC climate model has historically predicted a significant increase in global temperatures, and we haven't really seen this. The frequent statements held up by the media showing each month that passes is the hottest month on record willfully ignores the margin of error contained within these data sets. Simply put, the 15-year hiatus. Now, the hiatus, as it's called, is showing that, yes, we went through a period of time when there was warming, and then all of a sudden, some 16 years ago, it leveled off, and it hasn't warmed since that time. So this has really been a problem for the individuals who are believing this. Let me just go back, and this is from memory, but I'm sure it's right because I've said it so many times. That we had the first time they talked about global cooling was in 1895. In 1895, they came out and said that we're worried about a new ice age. This is when they coined that term, and they said that it's going to be, catastrophic. And then about 20 years later, it was in 2018, it changed, and all of a sudden there was global warming. There's a warming. This is the first time that the term global warming had been used. Then that stayed, things were warming up from that point until 1945. In 1945, it was rather interesting because that was at the end of World War II, and another cold spell came in. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you look back historically, the greatest surge in emissions of CO2 in America happened right after Second World War in 1945. And that precipitated not a warming, but another cold spell. In fact, they use the term, again, Ice Age. Now, that was supposed to, and of course, then we went another, in the 70s, it started warming. If you follow that, it's about every 30 years, this changes. You know, God is still up there. We're still going to have a changing in climate. And so what disappointed them is, on the other side, is that all the things they've been saying about global warming, it stopped 15 years ago and it's leveled off. Now, despite the clear evidence that the science on global warming is not settled, environmental alarmists are pushing ahead with an economically devastating agenda that is more about ideological outcomes than combating global warming. These efforts will come to a head at the end of this year when the United Nations hosts the 21st Conference on Parties, COP, Conference on Parties session in Paris. With this upcoming international spectacle, we should not only be questioning the science, but also the intentions and promises each country is making. Just last week, China was exposed for underreporting the amount of coal it burns by about 1 billion tons a year for the last 15 years. As the New York Times stated, and this is a quote, even for a country the size of China's size, the scale of correction is immense, and the increase alone is greater than the whole German economy emits annually from fossil fuels. They're talking about just the increase of what China has agreed to. They're trying to reduce, saying they're reducing some of their emissions. The increase that they admit is going to come is still going to be far greater than the whole German economy emits annually from fossil fuels. Then there's India, a country whose climate pledge is based on the premise that developing countries like the United States will pick up these costs to the tune of $2.5 trillion over the next 15 years, just over $160 billion a year. India stands to gain from American taxpayer dollars. And you have to keep in mind, each year for the last 21 years, you've had about 192 countries coming in. Their job, in order to come in and join the big party, is to say, yes, we're going to do something about reducing CO2 emissions. I have a lot of activity in Africa, and I remember in the little country of Benin, Africa, there was someone I know very well. His name was Luke. He was an official in Benin, West Africa. And I went up to him and I said, how come you're at this thing? You know better than this whole idea of global warming. He said, well, look, we have an opportunity to share in something like $100 billion because we're a minority country. And besides that, this is the biggest party of all every year. So we have these things that are the motivations for people that are coming in. Even the United Nations bureaucrats have been very candid about what they hope to achieve through the international climate negotiations, which has nothing to do with saving the environment. French President, former Jacques Chirac, when addressing the Kyoto Protocol, described it as the first component of authentic global governance. Margot Wallström, I remember this because I was there at the time that she said this. She was the former EU minister, stated international agreements are about the economy and, quote, leveling the playing field for big business worldwide. That has nothing to do with the environment. Most recently, Christina Figueres, the UN's top climate official, when talking about the Paris Climate Conference, said, and this is a quote by her, now, she was running this thing for the United Nations. She said, quote, this is probably the most difficult task we've ever given ourselves, which is to intentionally transform the economic development model for the first time in human history, unquote. Now, that's the one who's supposed to be making the case. Well, even the United States global warming commitment to the international community is questionable. President Obama is committing the United States to cut its emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. This promise is also just as questionable and hollow as what we are hearing from the countries I just mentioned. Now, this is the gap that is in there. If you look at the chart, it's self-explanatory. Not only does the president not have the backing of the United States Senate and the American people, but outside groups are finding that the president's method to achieve these reductions through climate regulations, primarily the Clean Power Plan, is faulty. According to the recent analysis by the U.S. Chamber, the president's intended national determination contribution, the INDC, that's what they use to say what commitments are being made, is about 33% short of meeting stated targets. On July the 8th, former Sierra Club chief climate counsel testified before my committee, I chair the Environment and Public Works Committee, about his own analysis that has found an even greater gap. The Clean Power Plan right now is a regulation that is promoted by the president. Now, they tried, starting in 2002, to pass legislation, and the legislation would have had a type of an activation of activity that is one that we analyzed that would cost the American people somewhere between $300 and $400 billion a year. Now, if it's $300 to $400 billion a year, what I always do, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, is when I hear a big number like that, I go back and I get the latest figures from my state of Oklahoma as to how much this means to each family that files a federal income tax. It would be about $3,000 a family. Now, that's a lot of money to a lot of the people that would, in my state of Oklahoma, and yet, by their own admission, it's not going to accomplish anything. You might remember Lisa Jackson. Lisa Jackson was the first director of the EPA, chosen by Barack Obama, and I asked her the question, actually, right before the Copenhagen party, that would have been in 2009. I said, now, you're going to come out with an endangerment finding, and if you have this endangerment finding, who is going to be the scientist? She said, well, the IPCC. And I said, well, assuming that you pass legislation, and that's what they're trying to do at that time, that was cap and trade legislation that I just described would cost between $300 and $400 billion. If you pass it, is that going to reduce the CO2 emissions worldwide? Now, keep in mind, this is Obama's choice she was the director of the EPA. She said, no, it wouldn't do that because this isn't where the problem is. The problem's in China, the problem's in India, the problem's in Mexico. And in fact, you carry it one step further. If you are going to have a reduction in it, and then that chases our manufacturing base to other countries where they don't have restrictions, then those countries would be countries like China, like India, that that don't have any controls on emissions. So it would end up being even more. But I mentioned that the president is going there in spite of the fact of where the American people are. This is very interesting because back in 2001 and 2002, the major polling showed that the number one concern at that time was global warming. And now that same poll, and this is the Gallup poll that came out in March, says it's number 15. And that's dead last in concerns of America. So, the American people have caught on. Well, the president's setting the American economy to suffer a great pain for no gain. The rising cost of energy will not only restrict access to affordable and reliable energy, but it will also undermine our businesses' ability to compete on a global scale and ultimately ship American jobs overseas to these countries who are going to be increasing emissions for the next decade. The outcome sounds a lot like the United Nations bureaucrats hope for, quote, leveling the playing field for big business worldwide. That was Margot that made that statement. I quoted her a minute ago. And it's no wonder the president is working so hard to circumvent Congress's role in committing the United States to an international agreement on climate change. He is playing to the wishes of the international community, to include French Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who, when talking about the forthcoming International Climate Summit, said that an agreement needed to be reached that would allow the president to make a commitment without going to Congress. And that's the whole idea. It's not just this one, it's other areas. We last week were discussing the big water bill. for a long period of time, well, historically always in this country, the control of water has been under state jurisdiction. And if it's under state jurisdiction, the only exception at that time was navigable waters. And so there was an effort by a senator from Wisconsin way back 5 years ago, and by Representative Oberstar from Minnesota to try to pass legislation that would take the word navigable out, and that means everything would go from the states back to the federal government. And not only did we defeat those bills, but both of those, senator and the House member, were defeated in 2010 at the next election. So the American people have caught on, and the summit is going to go, and I can assure you that we'll have a big delegation from the United States of America going over, talking about what America is going to do. And again, they're trying to do it through regulation. On the water rule that they had, they tried to do it legislatively, they couldn't do it. And so now the president's trying to do it with a rule. And so we go through this, we've gone through it with ozone and other things. So we're going to be faced with this, and clearly the president's agreement is about his legacy more than promoting a policy that's in the best interest of the American people. Americans need not only question the science that is not settled, but a policy that's being used to appease internationalists at the cost of America's future prosperity. You know, we've gone through this now for quite a while, I'd say for the last 18 years or so. And the problem that we're having, and I see a lot of the young people here and so many of the young people actually believe this stuff, and one of the reasons that they believe it is that they are taught it. This is a terrible confession for me to make, and I won't say which of I've got 20 kids and grandkids, and one of them, back when she was in the 7th grade, I think, 6th grade maybe, she came to me and she said, I'm saying to the president here, Popeye, see, I is for Inhofe, so our grandkids call us Popeye and Mama. Is that okay, Ben? Yeah. And said, Popeye, why is it you don't understand global warming? And I said, well, honey, show me why you're asking. And she showed me the propaganda that's coming from the EPA and going through our school system is incredible. In spite of that, the facts are there, and it's not going to work anymore this time than it did the last 21 such visits. And with that, I see a very good senator from Illinois, and I will yield the floor.
Mr. President,